On this Monday night, grief in the aftermath of a mass murder. At least 18 victims, 16 crime scenes in rural Nova Scotia.
This is something that we are dealing with right now that is heartbreak on top of other heartbreaks.
Questions about the RCMP's response and the search for a motive. Fighting COVID-19, the military's new mission inside Quebec care homes. And below zero, oil prices plunge to a record low.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. It is unthinkable. A quiet rural corner of Nova Scotia staggering under the weight of a despicable crime. One of the worst mass killings in Canadian history.
This happened in small towns. Portapique, Truro, Milford, and Enfield are places where people have deep roots. Places where people know their neighbors and look out for one another. Now these communities are in mourning, and Canada is in mourning with them. To the grandparent who lost a child, to the children who lost a parent, to the neighbor who lost a friend.
The RCMP say more than 18 people, men and women, are dead, plus the gunman.
It appears that some of the victims were known to the suspect, and others were targeted and not known to the suspect.
16 crime scenes are being investigated, including 5 houses burned to the ground. There may be more victims inside. For 12 hours, the gunman continued his rampage, able to keep going for so long because he was disguised, driving a mock RCMP vehicle and wearing a police uniform. Among his victims, RCMP Constable Heidi Stevenson.
Our hearts are broken. My heart is broken.
Murder on this scale is hard to comprehend, that it happened in the middle of a pandemic when anxiety was already high and when people were told to stay home and to save lives just adds to the agony. It was at home that some of the victims died. We have complete coverage tonight, beginning with Elizabeth McSheffrey on what we're learning about the victims.
She was a gifted violinist, and 17-year-old Emily Tuck shared her music as a way to entertain and encourage those told to stay at home during COVID-19. Emily's mother, Jolene Oliver, said to love poetry and books, and father, Aaron Tuck, remembered as a handyman with a gift for leatherwork. Just one of many families torn apart.
The sad part is that they're all gone together, but in a way, because of how close they were, I'm glad that none of them are actually suffering for each other, because they would never be able to survive without each other. They were very close.
At a time when we're praising nurses as heroes, 2 are being honored. Heather O'Brien and Kristen Beaton both worked for the Victorian Order of Nurses, which today described O'Brien as a wife, mother, and grandmother who shared her deep caring of others as a VON nurse for nearly 17 years. And Beaton, a continuing care worker, as a caring and compassionate member of the Victorian Order of Nurses team. Lisa McCulley taught grade 3 and 4. On Twitter, her Regional Center for Education says she was beloved by both her students and colleagues. A couple, both of whom were correctional officers, are among those killed. Sean McLeod worked at the Spring Hill Institution for more than 20 years, and Alana Jenkins at the Nova Institution for Women in Truro. Another couple, Greg and Jamie Blair, ran a natural gas and propane business near the area where the massacre took place. 54-year-old Gina Goulet was a 2-time cancer survivor from Shubenacadie and an avid recreational fisher. And the regional municipality of Durham says Dawn and Frank Madsen were longtime residents of their community. Dawn was a former long-term care worker. Constable Heidi Stevenson was the first casualty to be named in the tragedy. The 23-year member of the force was killed while responding to the chaos this weekend. She leaves behind her husband and 2 children. More victims will be named in the days to come, but RCMP Constable Chad Morrison will not be one of them. The 11-year veteran made it home from the hospital on Monday and was greeted warmly by his community in Enfield. He's healing from gunshot wounds in what is perhaps the one bit of good news to emerge from this tragedy. Elizabeth McSheffrey, Global News, Halifax.
The investigation is still in the early stages. Here's what we know of the timeline. At 11:30 on Saturday night, RCMP respond to a firearms complaint in the town of Portapique. The public advised to stay inside and lock their doors. When police arrive, they find multiple casualties. Nearly 9 hours later, the RCMP tweet that officers remain on scene, calling it an active shooter situation. They identify the gunman as 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman, considered armed and dangerous. The suspect is then seen again 30 kilometers east of Portapique, around Truro, driving a car that appears to be an RCMP cruiser and wearing what appears to be a police uniform. He was then seen heading from Brookfield towards Halifax along the Trans-Canada Highway, and after an encounter with police on Highway 2, drives off in a small SUV. The rampage ends in a standoff at this gas station in Enfield, near the Trans-Canada. That's where the gunman died. There is no known motive at this point. Police say no note from the gunman has been found. Ross Lord on what we do know about the investigation.
In the community where the killing spree started, it's going to take a long time for the world to make sense again.
I'm still, I believe, shocked and, befuddled. Don't really understand what's going on.
Devastated by what happened and afraid the news could become even worse.
We haven't heard from our friends, and we hope they're okay. The son has been trying to get a hold of them and still hasn't had any word.
Investigators say there are 16 crime scenes, including 5 houses burnt to the ground.
We believe there may be victims still within the remains of those homes.
They still don't know Gabriel Wortman's motive, why he went from a professional denturist to perpetrator of one of the biggest murder sprees in Canadian history. His high school yearbook caption suggests his future may include being an RCMP officer. No one expected him to disguise himself as a Mountie so he could kill unsuspecting victims.
Not in a million years. Not in a million years. Like I said, he was just, and it's cliche, right? I mean, you see this all the time when there's a murderer, the neighbors say how quiet and friendly he was. He was.
He worked primarily at this denture clinic in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The owner of this strip mall says Wortman rented a second clinic here in Halifax for more than 20 years, paying his rent on time, and recently driving what looked like an old police car with the decals removed but reflective tape still visible. A picture released at the height of the rampage suggests the car had been dressed up to be an almost perfect replica.
His ability to move around the province undetected was surely greatly benefited by the fact that he had a police or a vehicle that looked identical in every way to a marked police car.
Wortman was also wearing a partial or full RCMP uniform. After the first 911 calls, Nova Scotia RCMP limited communication to its Twitter page. There was a gap of 8 hours overnight between tweets, and unlike the COVID-19 message released over the Easter weekend, there was no emergency alert, leading to some pointed questions about whether the public was sufficiently warned. There are several investigations underway into the chaotic effort to stop the gunman. The arm's-length serious incident response team will investigate the final takedown and another incident involving RCMP members discharging firearms. The Mounties themselves will review a third incident, also surrounding the use of force. Just the start of what is sure to be an unprecedented review of how this happened and how authorities responded. Donna?
Ross Lord in Halifax, thanks. Because this happened in the midst of a pandemic, there can be no coming together at funerals. We'll have more on plans for mourning a little later. Right now, large gatherings are still banned, of course, because of the risk of spreading the coronavirus. Here's a look at the numbers in Canada right now. There are over 36,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Canada. That only reflects those people who have been tested. More than 1,600 people are known to have died from it. More than 900 of those people are in Quebec, the hardest hit province. 62 more deaths were reported there today. Some staff in hospitals in Quebec, including nurses and orderlies, are now being redeployed to long-term care homes. That's where the outbreaks are worst and where help is needed the most. As Mike Armstrong reports, even the military is doing what it can.
This is one of 5 teams of Canadian Armed Forces soldiers deployed Monday to Quebec seniors' residences. It's likely not a task any of them predicted when they joined the military, but that doesn't seem to be a problem.
It is most certainly unusual, but we are ready to adapt and overcome any challenge in our way, and we're mostly proud to be here.
Now, Quebec seniors' residences have been hit hard by COVID-19. They have about 4,000 cases in about 150 facilities. They're also short about 2,000 full-time workers. At this residence, one ward over the weekend was staffed by just 2 auxiliary nurses for 40 people. They were overwhelmed. To fill the gap, the military team of 14 nurses, medical technicians, and medical assistants hit the ground running.
Activities of daily living, we call it. So toileting, feeding, grooming, walking, assistance.
Well, we barely got in and we were already working knees deep in it. We were put to work as fast as they could.
Now, urgent help was needed in Nova Scotia as well. This seniors facility went from 50 COVID-19 cases Friday to 150 now. They also have 40 staff off work and had to call in help from the provincial health authority.
We've had to reach out. We're not able to manage this on our own. We were doing very, very well up until the last couple of days.
We're still in the middle of a battle.
In Ontario, the government says its numbers overall have likely peaked, but that the situation in seniors' residences continues to be a major concern. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Laval, Quebec.
Public health officials in Ontario say the restrictions on people's movements have slowed the spread, and though there were more than 600 new cases confirmed today, that's the biggest single-day increase so far. The pandemic, as Mike mentioned, appears to have peaked several weeks ahead of what was forecast. Jeff Semple explains what that means.
This family-run Toronto clothing store is hanging by a thread.
Surviving this is going to be very difficult.
Closed now for 6 weeks, its owner expects the business won't survive another month under lockdown.
I got to open this business back up. I've got inventory to sell, and I've got rent to pay, and I've got kids to feed.
But he and his fellow Ontarians just received some much-needed good news.
Today, we saw new modeling that shows there's some light at the end of the tunnel.
The Ontario government says the province's COVID-19 outbreak appears to have peaked a month earlier than expected.
We still have far to go, but thanks to our collective efforts, we're in a better position today.
Ontario is now expecting this outbreak will see 20,000 cases of COVID-19. That's a quarter of what the province had predicted just a couple of weeks ago, and is even better than their best case scenario.
Which is obviously encouraging. The cases are not going to skyrocket.
This infectious disease doctor helped to produce the latest models and says one area where they underestimated the outbreak was in long-term care homes.
Sadly, we just didn't acknowledge how vulnerable our vulnerable populations truly were.
But in the wider population, many are now wondering how much longer this lockdown will last.
I've been waiting for hip replacement surgery for almost 15 months. I'm wondering when you will be able to start the surgeries again.
Ontario's hospitals canceled non-emergency surgeries to make room for COVID-19 patients and now find themselves with a surplus of intensive care beds. The challenge, how to expand service, while also bracing for a second wave of cases.
It was relatively simple to stop the system. It's actually much more complex to actually turn it back on again.
Experts expect a slow easing of restrictions to begin in a matter of weeks, and small businesses could be among the first in line. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
A crude awakening coming up. Oil prices sink into uncharted territory. The price of oil has dropped into negative territory for the first time in history. There's too much being produced and not enough demand. And the impact on Canada is huge. David Akin has been watching this slide. And David, this collapse is putting even more pressure on Ottawa to offer a lifeline.
Oh, absolutely. Consider this, Donna. On Friday, you would have paid about $18 for a barrel of the benchmark West Texas Intermediate. You would have paid 18 bucks. Today, the producers will pay you $37 to take that barrel off their hands. They simply don't have any room to store it. Last week, the OPEC Plus nations agreed to cut global production by 10 million barrels a day, but demand has dropped 30 million barrels a day. That means 20 million barrels a day are being produced that no one can use. Here in Canada, one major producer, Husky, said today it would cut production by 80,000 barrels a day. Husky and some other producers also announced more cuts to their capital plans, more salary reductions, more job cuts. The federal government did announce some help for the sector Friday, but Conservatives say the help was too little, too late.
It is woefully inadequate for an energy sector and economy already decimated by this Liberal government. What will the Prime Minister's plan be when 7% of our GDP, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and hundreds of billions of dollars in federal and provincial tax revenues are permanently lost?
Meanwhile, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers told the government before this dramatic decline in price that the industry would need between $27 and $30 billion in assistance in order to survive. Donna?
All right. David Akin in Ottawa, thank you. A meatpacking plant in southern Alberta is temporarily shutting down because of an outbreak of COVID-19. The Cargill meatpacking plant employs more than 2,000 people. There have been more than 350 cases of COVID-19 linked to it. A company spokesperson is encouraging all employees to get tested. Production will stop once the meat already in the plant is processed. Ahead, why some Sydney beaches are reopening. People returned to some of Sydney, Australia's most popular beaches today, more than 3 weeks after they were shut down. Only exercise is allowed at the 3 city beaches. Strict physical distancing measures remain in place. Sunbathing and gatherings are still prohibited. Other famous beaches in Australia remain shut down. India is also starting to ease restrictions with some farmers and manufacturers back at work. The country, though, recorded its biggest daily spike in cases today, more than 1,500 new infections. Singapore also recorded its biggest single-day spike. Many of those infected there are foreign workers who typically are low paid and live in crowded housing. 3 cruise ships that have been sailing ever since this pandemic began are due to dock today. 18 Canadians and 7 Canadian crew members were on the 3 ships. Passengers would normally leave that ship every few days, but haven't been able to for 6 weeks after the captain decided to make the long journey home. Next, how do we grieve in these uncertain times? There are families across this country mourning those who have died of COVID-19, and in those small Nova Scotian communities where so many people were murdered. It is natural, of course, and normal to come together to mourn, but COVID-19 is robbing us of our rituals, and there will be no big memorials, no traditional funerals. With me is Pastor Stephen Adams. He's from Faith Baptist Church in Great Village, Nova Scotia. That's just down the road from Portapique. Pastor Adams, first, our condolences to everyone in the communities there. The grief must be so acute, and this is small-town Nova Scotia. Everyone is closely connected. How are people coping?
People, I think, are still in shock, and which I think most people who've gone through any kind of trauma or observed people going through trauma would appreciate the reality of that. It is to use a word like overwhelming would be a gross understatement.
The Premier says there can be no mass gatherings to grieve, that COVID-19 will not pause because of the pain. That must add heartbreak to the heartbreak.
I don't know if it adds to the heartbreak, but it sure makes it more difficult to be, there for other people and have other people provide, comfort.
There are plans for a virtual vigil on Friday. I know that is still in the works, but do you know what it might look like?
I'm not part of the planning committee for that. I have been asked if I would participate, and I said that I would. I know that a number of people have been asked to participate, community people and and people, you know, across the country, and the people here that are impacted so closely, you know, who've lost family members. They are in shock and grief, and so we're grieving along with them. And to try to wrap our minds around that is well, it's difficult. These are very difficult days. We're going through tremendous times of loss and grief. But this situation is compounded not just by the fact that it's so immense and involves so many people and so many families, but also because it's become a global grieving. I don't want for us to lose in all of this the people whose lives have been torn apart and whose hearts have been shattered by this. We're talking children without parents. We're talking about teachers and healthcare workers and family members, right? So I just don't want those people and their pain and to be somehow lost in all of the outpouring.
None of us do. Pastor Stephen Adams in Nova Scotia, thanks. That is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with some consoling words from Nova Scotia's Premier. He says the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living and not risk spreading COVID-19 by gathering. He's also asked people to tie the Nova Scotia tartan to a tree or put it in the window.
It may not seem like enough, but for now, it's a way for all of us to come together without coming together.
And James Dyson shared this tribute to the group, the Ultimate Online Nova Scotia Kitchen Party. His rendition of Amazing Grace dedicated to those who died in this tragedy. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves.